When it comes to the Titanic, we all know about the opulence and the extravagance of traveling in first class. We also know about the humble beginnings of the third class passengers going to America trying to start a new life. But one of the classes that I feel do not seem to get enough of attention is the second class passengers. Which is strange when you take into account that most working class Americans would fall into the category of second class passengers if we were to travel at sea. Even most of the survivors that were alive in the 80s and the 90s were themselves second class passengers on board the Titanic. Yet we hardly ever hear much about those accommodations. Hello, I'm Tashawn and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. And in today's video, we're going to talk about what it was like to be second class on the Titanic. So, without any further delay, let's dig into the experience of Titanic's forgotten class. The second class accommodations on the Titanic were said to have rivaled first class accommodations on other vessels of the time. And this does seem to be something that's true because Joseph and Juliette LaRoche were originally booked with first class tickets on another vessel that was going on her maiden voyage in April, and that was the France. But the France did not allow for children to eat in the dining saloons with their parents. They had to eat in their cabins. As you can imagine, 1912, it was very formal. There was multiple courses to the meals. And so kids would get a little bit antsy after a while in such a formal type of setting. And so I guess some ocean liners of the day just preferred that they didn't eat with the adults. Well, apparently with the White Star Line, and we know on the Titanic that wasn't the case, because Eva Hart mentioned having the last meal together as a family on Sunday morning, and then the LaRoches purposely booked the Titanic because they knew that was a vessel that would allow them to dine with their kids. And while we're on the subject of the Titanic's second class dining saloon, this would be a great time to bring up that this was one of the areas of the ship where a lot of things happened during the voyage. For one, this is where the passengers obviously ate their meals. They would have ate off of china that had a pattern like this. This is like sitting out in the dust, so if it's dusty, it's just because I don't use this. This is called the Delft Blue pattern. And in most cases, if you go to any exhibit where they have some of these recovered from the wreck site, the White Star logo has kind of just worn away from being at the bottom of the ocean for decades. So they would have eaten off of nice china. They would have had nice meals. I didn't even know it until I started reading into it a bit. But sometimes the food that they had in first class, they would also serve that type of food in second class. So the curry chicken, for example, they would rotate sometimes between first and second class with that. The dining saloon is also where Sunday service would have been held. So on April the 14th, that's where they would have gathered, and I believe Father Bowles did a sermon there, and I believe it had something to do with being shipwrecked or being lost at sea. Like that, it was in the title, being lost at sea or something with souls. I'll look into that, but they would have had their service in this dining saloon the same way that the first class passengers had their service in the first class dining saloon. Also in the saloon, around 8:30, I believe it is, 8:30 on April the 14th, Reverend Carter, he had arranged with the purser for them to have a gathering here so that a bunch of passengers could all sing hymns. There was a piano in this saloon that the band would have used, And from 8:30 to 10 p.m. on April the 14th, they had this little get together in second class with about 100 people in attendance. And they would have just sang different types of hymns. There would have been requests. The person would have played it on a piano. They all would have sang it. There was apparently one passenger who had extensive knowledge of the history of these hymns and what they meant and everything. And so anytime a request was put in and they would get ready to sing it, he would give like a little brief history of the song and explain, why it was written, what it means, and then they would get into it with singing the song. It was like their own 1912 version of like a jukebox or something. And of course, it would not be a party if there was no dancing. The band was not just limited to the first class passengers. Second class had their own band as well. I believe it was 4 in first class, 4 in second. And even the band themselves were technically listed as second class passengers. They were not crew because they weren't working for a White Star Line. They were contracted from another company. I know that in one documentary, it was mentioned how Edith Brown, a second class passenger, she was looking forward to the dancing and everything. She had her pretty dress. She was a teenager at the time, so she's ready to show out, she's ready to have fun. And that's one of the things that I've really noticed when I researched Titanic is just how powerful music really used to be back in the day. In today's time, I feel like most of us, we put our AirPods in and we listen to it privately. But back in those days, as I'm reading like all of these different passenger and crew accounts, it seemed like people gathering and just singing and dancing and playing random instruments that they might know how to play. It just seems like it was way better of a social environment back then, if that makes sense. You could just go on a piano and start playing something, and then someone might walk up and start singing, and then next thing you know, you got a crowd of 100 people there watching. And maybe it's because this was in the era before cell phones and being able to kind of pull yourself back from the social scene a bit. But nonetheless, in all 3 classes, it seems like music was just something that really just gathered everyone and brought everyone together. One of the features that made the second class on the Titanic stick out is that they had their own elevator. And of course, in 2025, when you hear they had an elevator, you're like, whoop-de-doodle-doo. So, but in 1912, that was seen as a luxury. There were ocean liners that only had like one elevator for the first class passengers. And Titanic had 3 for her first class passengers and 1 for the second. And Lawrence Beesley, he mentions that this really came in handy for the passengers that just couldn't navigate going up and down all of these stairs if their cabin was all the way at the bottom of the ship. And so this elevator really came in handy for that. And it is a little bit of a nice gesture when you think about how in 1912, there was so little thought or effort put in for people with disabilities or people that just couldn't get around that well. So these lifts, as minor of a thing as it may seem to us today, it would have been a luxury and a godsend to some of the passengers on board. And even though there were plenty of adults who would prefer to take the lift, according to Beesley, it was the stairways that was kind of like the playground or the jungle gym of the second class children. He said that everyone kind of unofficially let the kids have this as their little play space. So you can just imagine these kids running up and down and all around the second class stairway. So if the children were having a good time in the stairway, the adults, their area was the library. And I know that doesn't sound very entertaining, but once again, Lawrence Beesley, who was very detailed in his book, he said that in the second class area, the library was kind of like the heart of where everyone gathered. They would come in here to read books and write letters. Remember, this is 1912. So if you wanted to stay in touch with someone that you couldn't physically see every day, there was no FaceTime, texting, cell phones, anything like that. You had to write them a letter. There was no Facebook or social media. And so people wrote significantly more letters than we do today. I honestly can't even tell you the last time I wrote a letter. I think it was to cancel a Planet Fitness subscription or something. And when you walked out of the second class library, there was a little box right at the front where you could drop your letters in so they could be taken to the ship's post office. You may sometimes hear me in my videos about the passenger stories. I'll say, oh, and right when they left, they wrote a letter about how beautiful the ship was. And I've had people in the comments say, well, how did they send a letter from the ship? Well, the Titanic had 3 ports of call, 2 of them after it left Southampton. And the letters that these passengers would have put in these boxes, it would have been sent off on the tenders before they were sent off out to sea. So that's how you have these letters that they were writing to their loved ones in Europe, because they probably wrote them and mailed them before the Titanic headed out. And so Lawrence Beesley says that in the second class library, that is what people did a lot of the time for most of the day. And he said that on Thursday, which would have been April the 11th, and then Sunday, April the 14th, it was either too cold or too windy to be outside in the open deck areas. So this is where a lot of them congregated. And speaking of the outside areas, the promenades, this is something that the second class passengers would have enjoyed as well. Ruth Becker, she talks about how she passed the time walking her brother around in his stroller, just pushing him around through the decks. Another big thing with the second class library is that this would have been where the ship's daily mileage would have been reported. So how many miles the ship had covered each day, they would have posted that here. Because a very popular thing that passengers would do during this time is they would place bets on what time and day the ship would arrive in New York. Now, the Titanic did have a second class smoking room, and this would have been where the men would have gathered to smoke, do tobacco, play cards, gamble, all of that. Back in those days, smoking was still seen as a pretty masculine thing to do, so it really wasn't super proper for a woman to smoke yet. I don't think that really took off until like the 20s. Even when the Titanic collided with the iceberg, just like in the first class smoking room, there were men in the second class smoking room who were playing cards, smoking, having a drink, and they saw the iceberg go by the windows. Now, the crazy part about it is these men didn't even get up to investigate it. They just looked out the window and saw like, oh, there goes an iceberg going by. I'm way too nosy to do that. Like, I would have, the moment I saw it, I would have been running out there to see what it is, but I guess they were in a very intense card game. The Titanic also had a first and second class barbershop, so each class had their own barbershop, except for third. And the second class barbershop, it also kind of doubled as the gift shop. Eva Hart remembers that as she was walking around the ship with her dad, he took her to the barbershop, and like most fathers, whatever she wanted, he was buying it for her, spoiling his little girl. And also, Eva Hart mentions how as she was walking around with her father, they bumped into Captain Smith. So apparently Captain Smith, he wasn't one of those captains that only talked to the first class passengers, because according to her, Captain Smith had a conversation with her father, and then he made a comment about a doll that she had. And I'm gonna tell y'all a little secret that I have. Don't tell anybody else. Personally, I think the second class accommodations on the Lusitania look nicer than the second class accommodations on the Titanic. But apparently on the Lusitania, she had a reputation for vibrating really badly. She was the fastest ship in the world, her and her sister ship, the Mauretania. And that was one of the things that passengers and even the crew complained about, was that the ship vibrated so badly So yeah, it got you where you needed to go quickly, but it was a pretty uncomfortable ride. And supposedly, the second class accommodations was like the worst area for it. And I think that that is true because when I was reading Lawrence Beesley's account, he mentioned that when they were in the dining saloon, him and his shipmates, they were talking about how stable the Titanic seemed, how there wasn't as much vibration and it was way more comfy. So I guess the Titanic, even though in my opinion the second class didn't look as nice, it was the comfort, and that's what White Star Line was going for. And that's my video on what it was like to travel on the Titanic in second class. Um, for this video, I only focused on the different rooms and what people did in them. I didn't really want to go into the sinking stuff because, in all honesty, when I tell the passenger stories, that kind of pieces that together. I just wanted to do kind of like a lighthearted video on what people on the Titanic did for fun. What did they do before the ship hit the iceberg? And so that's the second class experience. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. In the meantime, y'all be safe and y'all have a good one.